Welcome, everyone, on this very dreary, rainy day. Hope you're all someplace cozy where you're able to join us. We are excited to talk about early literacy screening guidance. So before we get started, I just thought I would introduce our team. I'm Siobhan Allen, a literacy specialist with the Office of Educator Effectiveness, and I am joined by Claire Abbott, the Director of Educator Effectiveness. We are lucky to be joined today by two colleagues within the Office of Literacy and Humanities, and I'll let them introduce themselves. Linda?
Hi, everyone. My name is Linda Sunarine. I'm our Assistant Director of Literacy in the Center for Instructional Support, and I am joined by my colleague, Mary.
Hi, I'm Mary Brown, and I am the Early Literacy Project Coordinator for DESE. So excited to be here as well to talk about screening.
Linda and Mary are going to walk you through so much today, starting with the regulation, looking specifically at what's in the recently passed regulation. And then we're going to dig into the why, the importance of early literacy screening. We'll discuss a few of the headlines from the early literacy screening guidance. And then we'll share some resources before we open it up to a brief question and answer section toward the end of our time together. With that, I will kick it off.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to put a link in the chat that I'm going to refer to. So today we are here to talk about the early literacy screening regulation and the recently released early literacy screening guidance and resources. Before we get started, we'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the recommendations and revisions provided by our many thought partners here in Massachusetts, educators, experts from universities and organizations, community members, DESE offices that you can see listed on the slide. Oh, thank you, Siobhan. In addition, on each of the slides, you'll notice that there are page numbers to make sure you can clearly see where the content that we're going over in this presentation is linked in the guidance, because everything in our presentation you'll be able to find in the guidance, which you can locate on that link that was shared in the chat. So if you click that link, there's going to be a blue box, and at the top of the blue box, you can click into the guidance document, and it should have a cover similar to the one that you see on the screen. We'll give everyone a moment to get oriented to the guidance document. You can feel free to follow along, or you can feel free to refer to it later. If you do have questions, and Siobhan, correct me if I am wrong, are people able to put them in the chat, and then we can see either if we answer them throughout or if we come back to them during our question and answer portion? Is everyone able to send in questions? Great. All right, we can go to the next slide, and I'm going to pass it to Mary.
Great. So let's get started with the early literacy screening regulation. So as many of you know, the Board of Education, Elementary and Secondary Education recently amended the special education regulations to add an early literacy screening requirement, which just went into effect July 1st of this year. The amendment reflects feedback from parents, educators, experts, advocates, and specialists. And as you can see on the slide, the new regulation has three main components: assessment, instructional response, and family communication. So today we're going to explore each of these components in a little more detail. But first, before we go to the next slide, Linda's going to give us a bit of background about the importance of early literacy screening. So now we can go to the slide.
While early literacy screening is, yes, now a part of the regulation, we also truly believe that screening is part of an equitable, culturally and linguistically sustaining literacy plan that supports all of our students. Early literacy universal screening is proactive and designed to gather information on the most predictive literacy skills, making it possible to identify each student's risk of experiencing reading difficulties, including risk of dyslexia. This screening process and the resulting data analysis allows educators to intervene with targeted, evidence-based instruction at the first indication that a student may be experiencing challenges in learning to read, which we know is more effective the younger our students are. Using a multi-tiered system of support model, educators can use data to inform core instruction, instructional pacing, intensity, and differentiation of targeted intervention, as well as determine if additional assessment is needed. As we think of our teacher candidates, it'll be important for them to understand how early literacy screening fits into an MTSS system and how it functions alongside other literacy assessments and data sources. We can go to the next slide.
So in keeping with the importance of screening, let's look at what screening assessments do and don't do. And this chart can be found on page 4 in the guidance document if you're following along with us. So a universal screening assessment is designed to distinguish between students at risk and students not at risk. It's also important to look at framing universal screening as part of the district's overall literacy plan. So screening is one of the ways a student in grades K-3 will be assessed in reading during the school year, and is another way teachers monitor a student's reading development and growth. And this is actually how universal screening is framed in the introductory family letter, which you can find in the appendix of the guidance document. So screening makes it possible to see if a student is at risk of developing reading difficulties, including risk of dyslexia. And as we know, screening does not diagnose dyslexia or other disabilities, but it does help us understand which students may need additional support to be successful readers. And as a reminder, dyslexia is a specific learning disability in reading and is determined following a formal evaluation as part of the special education eligibility process. Dyslexia is not determined by a single test. And I think if there's one thing we really want to make sure our teacher candidates know, is that this is not a dyslexia screener. It is an early literacy universal screening tool or a screening assessment. And even with teachers and assistant superintendents, we've had a lot of meetings in which we've had to help people understand that this is not a way that we are identifying a screen and saying this student has dyslexia, this student does not. This is all about risk of poor reading outcomes. And in fact, the International Dyslexia Association suggests a diagnosis of dyslexia includes consideration of background information, school history, and comprehensive assessment of both oral and written language skills. And we can go to the next slide for Linda.
Thank you. So now that we've talked about the role of early literacy screening and the regulation, we want to orient you to the early literacy screening guidance document and talk a little bit about the intentions of how that document is structured. So the early literacy screening guidance is a school or district's one-stop shop for all regulation and screening questions. This is also a living document, meaning that it will continue to be updated and expanded based on feedback from schools, districts, and organizations. The guidance as a whole was written to support district and school teams with varied experiences with early literacy screening. Across the state, we have districts in various stages of developing and implementing an early literacy screening protocol. For this reason, the guidance document includes both the regulation and recommendations. So throughout this document, you're going to see that there are sections that say the regulation requires and other sections with recommendations and considerations so that districts can make decisions that align to their local context. We believe Massachusetts educators are the experts on their students, families, and communities, and our intent with recommendations and considerations is to empower everyone with information and resources. It will be important for our teacher candidates to understand what is required versus what is recommended. In addition, it will also be helpful for teacher candidates to have a sense of what might be a district or school level decision versus what might be a classroom level decision when it comes to screening. We can go to the next slide. As we get started today, we're going to focus on 3 main areas that address the parts of the regulation and recommendations that highlight best practices. What we're previewing is not exhaustive, and based on the emails and calls and questions we receive in office hours, these are top of mind for our schools and districts. So we're going to continue to highlight different key skills that we think will be helpful for teacher candidates. And we'll start with how to select an early literacy screening assessment. We can go to the next slide. Mary, can you tell us, how did DESE review early literacy screening assessments?
Well, actually, reviewing screening assessments is not new. DESE's practice of reviewing and approving screening assessments comes out of an expert panel recommendation. In 2012, the legislature passed an act relative to third grade reading proficiency, and this law called for the creation of an early literacy expert panel. This panel met for several years, and one of their main recommendations was that screening using valid and reliable assessments needed to become more prevalent statewide. And based on that, DESE began reviewing early literacy screening assessments and provided an approved list in 2018. When the dyslexia guidelines came out in 2020, it became clear that our criteria needed adjusting. So the 2022 criteria are more extensive and more rigorous than those used in the past. The categories on the slide summarize the criteria that were used in 2022 to review screening assessments. And as a result of this process, we now have 9 approved screening assessments, which assess a range of early reading skills and can identify risk for reading difficulties. So we can go to the next slide.
Mary, what are the DESE approved early literacy screening assessments?
So as mentioned earlier, due to the regulations, schools will be required to use, or I should say are required to use, a screening assessment that is approved by DESE. So first of all the screening assessments on this list are approved. Currently, there are 9 approved assessments, 4 fully meet DESE's expectations, and 5 additional assessments partially met expectation. DESE reviews early literacy universal screening assessment submissions on a rolling basis. So for the most up-to-date approved list, we're encouraging teacher candidates, and actually all teachers and districts, to visit DESE's early literacy universal screening assessment webpage, because that will always have the most up-to-date information. It's actually in the process of being updated this week. So this slide actually captures the newest addition to the list, which is Amira, which will be, by the end of the week, will be showing on our website. Submissions from vendors are being accepted through December 2024. So we do anticipate this list may change. We might have some assessments that are partially meets expectations may move over to meets expectations as they provide evidence on the effectiveness of their assessment. So we can go to the next slide.
Thank you for going over all of the screeners, Mary. And so if I'm a school or a district and I want to learn more about a screener, what are some of the resources that are available to me?
So there are 2 really helpful resources to support educator teams with selecting a screening assessment that's right for their district, or for learning more about the assessment already in place. And that's where I probably see our teacher candidates will probably look at this more about building their own capacity and understanding screening assessments and what they offer. So below the guidance on the website, you'll find each approved screening assessment is listed. And along with that is a list of kind of the highlights of that assessment, some challenges, and some considerations. And another really helpful document is the at a glance document, which is also linked on that page, because with that document, teachers can see the features of each assessment, and it will help them understand if there's subtests that maybe they would like more information on, whether or not that is included in the district selected screening assessment. And if there's something that they're interested in, they can look to see what other screening assessments offer. But again, that goes back to Linda's statement earlier about what's a district decision and what's a classroom decision. So again, like all the other things we've said, all of this is on our webpage and it is updated regularly. So we encourage people to check it as often as possible. I think we can go to the next slide. Great.
How should this chart support a teacher candidate's understanding of early literacy screening?
So as we know, reading development is a dynamic process that evolves throughout the early grades, and skills that are highly predictive of reading difficulties among kindergarten students may no longer be as predictive among second graders. Therefore, recommendations for skill-based subtests vary by grade level, and in some cases, time points within a year. It is important for teacher candidates to know and understand each of these subtests. Knowing how each skill progresses through grades will support their knowledge of the continuum of skill development and how to respond when students do not have the requisite grade level skills. Chapter 6 of the Dyslexia Guidelines provides a wealth of background information on the importance of predictive skills. So the trickier part is that educators from districts using screening assessments with gating rules or using computer adaptive tests will wonder how this list of skills fits with the screening currently occurring in their districts. So it will be important for teacher candidates to know more about gating rules and computer adaptive assessments, to know when or if they should override the system and or disregard discontinue rules. DESE does generally recommend that the assessment be used as it is intended, but educators should also consider including additional subtests whenever necessary. So please be aware that screening assessments do not all consider the same subtests when determining the composite score. So more information is available on the website under considerations, as well as in the vendor's technical manual. I think we can go to the next slide. And Linda, we always receive questions about considerations for student groups. Can you shed some light on this important topic?
The regulation requires that all students in grades K-3, including multilingual learners and students with disabilities, be assessed. To better support all students, there are important considerations. Let's start with multilingual learners. Educators should not wait until students' English oral language proficiency is fully developed to assess multilingual learners to identify risk of reading difficulties. This can result in a delay of evidence-based interventions. While the regulation does not require that students are screened in their home language, it is important to approach screening through a culturally and linguistically responsive lens. This can include assessing students' language skills in reading in both their native language when available and in English when determining their current levels of performance. Observation-based protocols to provide a wider view of students' skills in various contexts, including both academic and social settings. Having conversations with families about students' prior literacy instruction in native language and any history of reading difficulties, and interpreting English screening assessment results through a lens of second language acquisition. Involving ESL teachers in this process is important because they can help interpret results in the context of second language acquisition. Even if the ESL teacher does not speak the language of all students and families, they bring an important expertise in understanding typical language development and second language acquisition. This can also help to communicate results to families and determine appropriate instructional supports. In order to have a complete picture of a student's progress in learning to read, schools and districts should consider multiple points of data. The guidance includes more information on how to interpret data for multilingual learners in order to make a determination of concern. In the next few weeks, we will also have a revised Chapter 9 of the Massachusetts Dyslexia Guidelines that will also be posted and that will support screening of multilingual learners.
And so let's turn our attention to students with disabilities. Teacher candidates should have a strong understanding of the IEP for each of their students. With this information, they can be an advocate for their student and collaborate effectively with the special education team to ensure the student is set up for success in terms of screening. Most students with disabilities can be assessed with the same screening assessment as their peers, though schools and districts may determine a different DESE-approved screening assessment may be appropriate for some students. For example, for some students with disabilities, it may be beneficial for the student to be assessed with a tool that is brief, with a teacher closely monitoring the student's engagement. All DESE-approved screening assessments include accommodations, and teachers should have an understanding of these accommodations, though it is important to remember that many accommodations are likely to change how the assessment functions. Schools and teachers should review the Universal Screening Assessments Administration Manual to better understand available accommodations and their implications. In the guidance document, we also included links to accommodation information for each approved screening assessment. In some cases, results for students using accommodations, such as performing a fluency task untimed, can be used to measure individual student growth, but scores are no longer determinant of risk. So while screening will occur for all students, it will be important for teacher candidates to understand how collecting data and interpreting data can be done to center the unique needs of all students, especially multilingual learners and students with disabilities. Okay, Linda, I think we're ready for the next topic from the screening guidance. So we'll go to the next slide.
Next, we're going to orient ourselves to thinking about how screening and the requirements of the regulation fit into family communication. We can go to the next slide.
Linda, what information must be shared with families according to the regulation?
We are often asked to clarify what type of communication is required under the regulation. According to the regulation, when a student scores significantly below benchmarks, schools and districts must inform the family, students' caregivers of the screening results, the subsequent instructional response, and offer the student's family an opportunity for a follow-up discussion. While schools are required to share information only with families of students who score significantly below benchmark, our recommendation is that schools inform all families of their child's screening results. This promotes open and proactive communication about students' academic progress with all families. As teacher candidates prepare for full responsibility in the licensure role, it is important that they observe and practice supportive and informative communication of assessment results with families. We can go to the next slide.
And Linda, what are some examples of communication that could be shared with families?
While the regulation doesn't define the type of communication as a letter or a meeting or a phone call, that is a local decision, there are sample family letters in the DESE guidance for communicating with families throughout the process. These are samples provided as a resource, but it is not required to use these specific letters. They are available, editable, and translated. The letters cover topics such as introducing screening, sharing screening results with families, and talking about a screening result that is significantly below benchmark. Whether a school or district chooses to use these sample letters, the language within the letters can be helpful in getting accustomed to what is a proactive and direct way to talk about student screening results. For teacher candidates, they should feel comfortable talking about student results and their planned instructional responses in family-friendly terms. We can go to the next slide.
And so what are some of those best practices for sharing information with families?
On page 13 of the guidance, there are do's and don'ts of family communication based on the experiences of Massachusetts educators on what has worked well to create strong and positive home-family partnerships. We encourage educators to use these do's and don'ts as a guide as they reflect on communicating with families. We can go to the next slide. Next, we're going to orient ourselves to thinking about how screening and the requirements of the regulation fit into a multi-tiered system of support when you're analyzing student results. Next slide. Mary, can you talk more about the considerations when a district is determining significantly below benchmarks for each individual screening assessment?
Yes, so the chart you're looking at highlights the language used by each approved screening assessment to signify significantly below relevant benchmarks. And as mentioned earlier, schools are required to take special steps anytime a student's result is significantly below relevant benchmarks for age-typical development in specific literacy skills. These steps include determining appropriate instructional plans and progress monitoring, as well as communicating results to caregivers. We have often been asked how schools should determine if a student is significantly below benchmark. DESE recommends using the 25th percentile or less metric to define this category, though it's important to know the regulation does not quantify a metric. Approved early literacy screening assessments each use their own metric to determine if a student is significantly below relevant benchmarks. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So Linda has already shared an overview of family communication requirements when a student's result is significantly below relevant benchmarks. The regulation also states that schools must determine the appropriate instructional response as well as how student progress will be monitored. The regulation provides examples of actions within the general education program for schools to consider, and these include differentiated or supplementary evidence-based reading instruction. Students that are at risk of future reading difficulty most likely need intensive evidence-based intervention. And in terms of intensive intervention, schools should consider options such as group size, whether that's an individual instruction, what's the frequency and duration. All these actions can be adjusted based on level of intensity. So while early literacy assessment tools are helpful to identify students who may be at risk for reading difficulties, evidence-based classroom instruction is vital to every student. The best early literacy universal screening program will not make a difference if classroom instruction does not target student needs with evidence-based, culturally and linguistically sustaining practices. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So Linda, what are the important topics to consider for teaching candidates related to early literacy universal screening?
So throughout this presentation, we tried to highlight what are some of those key understandings that might be beneficial to teaching candidates. In addition, on page 15 of the guidance, there's a list of topics that will support educators to implement any screening assessment, interpret the results, determine instructional next steps for students, and communicate with families about the results in a supportive and empowering way. So this is just a list for your reference that we wanted to call out because we think it could be very helpful. We can go to the next slide.
You want to share the resources and supports available, Linda?
So some of these resources we've already talked about, such as the approved early literacy universal screening resources to help learn more about screeners, which Mary spoke about. In addition, the Massachusetts Dyslexia Guidelines provide direction and support for district staff at all levels with resources to support students with screening and evidence-based instruction. In addition, we have screening office hours. So on that same link that we put in the chat, there are office hours that are for any district school or yourselves. If you have any question related to screening or the regulation, you can sign up for a time. And then Mary and I are there to answer questions, to be thought partners. In addition, we are working on some screening plug and play resources that will support districts with a comprehensive early literacy screening protocol. So imagine slide decks and webinars on some of those key topics that were on that list that you can find on page 15. And that was a lot of talking. And now we would love to transition to some questions and answers to know what is top of mind for you and how can we be supportive.
In order to be able to continue recording, we would prefer for you to drop questions in the question and answer feature. That way we're not obligated to come onto camera or come off mute, and we're able to share it more broadly. Because I think if you have a question, probably other people have that same question. So if you just wanted to take a minute to populate the Q&A with any questions that came up for you as Linda and Mary were going through the early literacy screener guidance, now's the time.
Should we start reading the questions?
We can, sure.
One of the questions is, we are experiencing some challenges with our teacher candidates having access to data about the learners in their practicum classroom. One district uses a digital platform for IEPs, curriculum, and screening results. Access to this platform is not being provided to the teaching candidate. How may we advocate for access to such information for our teacher candidates?
I think that's a great question. And I think you're right in that it is something that we need to advocate for in order to be fully prepared for their role and responsibility as teachers on day one after they achieve licensure. They really do need access to that data in order to practice making data-informed decisions and in order to practice communicating with families about the results of assessment data. And so really being able to think about the partnership with that school district and advocating for your teacher candidates to be able to have access to that platform is key.
Usually what I've seen, I'm going to go back to my principal days. What used to happen was that you teacher candidates had access just to that classroom. And they did, obviously they didn't have the whole school, but they did have access to that classroom. And I'm wondering how much of that is a district-based decision on what happens, because I remember how challenging it was sometimes for us to have our teacher candidates participate in special education meetings for especially for eligibility meetings. Those were sometimes really tricky. So I definitely see that almost as a with certain districts being a little bit more closed about you know, FERPAs in terms of like what they want to share. But I think that's a great point about they need to have access, because they need to have an understanding of, especially if gating rules, and especially platforms in which the computer adaptive assessments, because you have a better understanding of which subtests were administered and which ones were not administered. So you can have a really get into that whole concept of data informed decisions about what needs to happen next. So totally get that. Oh, so there was a follow-up to that. The principal, IT, and district coordinator is not allowing access, indicating only teachers can access the platform. Oh my gosh, that's so disappointing. I think that's something that we can bring back to the team to maybe problem solve and see how we can maybe put out some kind of encouragement, but I appreciate knowing that.
One other idea is to have like a coordinated, like printable versions being accessible. I know sometimes like logins, like there's a finite number based on financials that can be made. But I'm wondering also if there's a possibility of printing, since most of these platforms can easily print student data and the information that's provided there too.
That's true.
Linda,
So-
we also had a question about the dyslexia guidelines. Are you able to talk a little more about the connection between the early literacy screener guidance and the dyslexia guidelines?
I'm going to pass that one to Mary. I feel like she does such an excellent job explaining that.
So the really tricky part of this is that we have the regulation, which is very kind of vague in parts. It refers to this dyslexia guidelines, but it doesn't give you a lot of quantifiable information. And then we have the dyslexia guidelines, which are very specific and talk about individual subtests. So the dyslexia guidelines are not the regulation. And I think that's one of the key things that we want to make sure our teacher candidates understand. The regulation is something else. It reflects the dyslexia guidelines to an extent. But the way I always think of the what they've done with the regulation is they formalized aspects of the dyslexia guidelines, but it does not have the specificity that you will find in the dyslexia guidelines. For example, you saw that list of subtests that we really feel teacher candidates should know. I mean, you should know what a RAN, they should know what a RAN is. It's an important subtest, but they also need to know that a RAN is impacted by a student's attention. So if you have a student that has ADHD, their RAN test may not look so strong, and they need to have an understanding of that. So you can read that type of information in the dyslexia guidelines, but the regulation is much more general. It's really just about making sure that we're screening students and making sure that we have, no one has kind of fallen through the process, and that parents are informed if their student is not, where they need to be, that the parents are being informed of these results that are significantly below benchmark. So you definitely have kind of that regulation, which is a little bit vague in some regard, and then you have the dyslexia guidelines, which is all based on research and data, and it really is recommendations and suggestions. So our hope is that you're going to use both of those documents kind of together, that we have to meet the regulation. The dyslexia guidelines is not talking about informing families of a result within 30 school days, but the regulation is. So you have your kind of building teacher capacity through the Massachusetts dyslexia guidelines. And it's just chapter 6 is so great in helping teachers understand about those subtests. And then Linda's done tremendous work on chapter 9 about multilingual learners. So you have all of this incredible wealth of background information that will help you, will support your understanding of kids that are at risk in reading. And then you have the regulation, which is kind of that part that's requiring you to screen. So they both have different functions, but they do speak to each other to some degree.
And I'll just add on that the guidance document itself is trying to serve as a bridge between the two, to help really connect what's in the dyslexia guidelines to the regulation.
And then we just have a follow-up about the Massachusetts dyslexia guidelines. When do we anticipate that the updated guidelines will be released?
It should be in the next 2 weeks. There is an extensive review process, and it is in its final leg of review. And as soon as I get the 2 thumbs up, it will be posted, and we will make sure that we're sharing that widely. In the meantime, if you do have specific questions in relation to supporting multilingual learners or bidialectal learners, please feel free to directly reach out to me.
We are also updating we're in the process of updating the early literacy universal screening guidelines as well to meet that regulation. That's all being updated as well, because what we've learned from our office hours is that teachers, administrators want additional information. So we are going to be adding some of those components that people felt they needed more background information on. So that is also in the process of being updated, and which is a good thing, because we look at both of these as live documents. We want them to be constantly evolving and meeting the needs of districts and teachers.
I think that's it for questions so far. Can give a few moments wait time just in case somebody's typing. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for attending and learning a little bit more about the early literacy screening guidance. And thank you so much to our colleagues in the Office of Literacy and Humanities, Linda and Mary, for joining us today and providing your expertise in this topic. I hope everybody has a wonderful afternoon, and I'm sure I will see you all soon.
Siobhan, can we just encourage everyone, if they have additional questions to those office hours, we would welcome them to come and share questions that they're hearing from teacher candidates as well, because that will also help inform the next version of those of the guidance documents.
Thank you, Mary. That's an important flag. And I can also follow up to anybody who was registered for today's webinar with the email addresses of both Linda and Mary, so that we can share those more broadly as well.
Perfect.
Thank you for having us.